Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April meeting plenary discussion on science on a global scale. I'm Phil Bucksbaum from Stanford University and SLAC. I'm last year's president of the APS, and I'll be the panel chair for this session. Some of the most impressive advancements of physics in the 21st century have come from experimental efforts that engage thousands of physicists from different countries and different backgrounds, all working with funding from diverse national science agencies. By sharing these infrastructure costs and combining expertise, we now have gravity wave telescopes, we have neutrino observatories, we have Higgs producing colliders, and we even have black hole imaging systems. These benefits are accompanied by new challenges to our physics culture. They raise questions about our scientific independence and our creativity, educational and career advancement challenges, and even sometimes politics when scientists come from different countries with different and sometimes rival views on governance and on national security. So for the next 90 minutes, I'll be moderating a discussion among 4 leading international scientists on these issues. Young-Kee Kim is here from the University of Chicago, JoAnne Hewitt from the SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory, Luisa Cifarelli from the University of Bologna, and Fiona Harrison from Caltech. I'll introduce each of them more fully as we begin, but first, here are some logistics for the session. Now, following our opening remarks and some discussion, the panelists will discuss some of your questions on global scale physics. So we invite you to pose questions in the Q&A box that you can access from your browser screen. And I'll then monitor the questions and pass them along to the panelists. Please keep in mind, as you formulate your questions, to adhere to the APS Code of Conduct, and also remember to use the Q&A window for your questions and not the chat window. Now, I apologize in advance if I don't get to your question, but I'm looking forward to hearing from many of you. Our first panelist is Professor Young-Kee Kim from University of Chicago. Professor Kim is an experimental particle physicist. She brings her perspective as a member of the Large Hadron Collider's ATLAS collaboration, a member of the NSF's Center for Bright Beams collaboration, and as past chair of the APS Division of Particles and Fields. She also brings her perspective as chair of the physics department and senior advisor to the provost on global scientific initiatives at the University of Chicago. Professor Kim, welcome.
Thank you, Phil, for a very nice introduction. Let me share my slide. Do you see this? Okay. So again, thank you, Phil, for your very nice introduction. And I'm very pleased to participate in this panel conversation today. Since I'm the first person to speak and I have experienced the growth of the collaborations as a collider physicist over 35 years, I thought it would be good to show what I have witnessed firsthand in my career. I hope this will give our audience some sense of the evolution in particle physics. I started my collider physics career in the late 80s as a graduate student. I joined AMI experiment at the 50 to 60 GeV electron-positron collider Tristan in Keikei, Japan. We had about 60 collaborators from 4 countries. I then joined CDF experiment at the 2 TeV proton antiproton collider, Tevatron at Fermilab. In the early 90s, CDF had about 200 collaborators from 3 countries, but a decade later, it grew to more than 600 collaborators from 20 countries. I'm currently a member of the ATLAS experiment at the 13 TeV proton-proton collider LSC at CERN, which has about 3,000 collaborators from about 40 countries. So you can see I followed higher and higher energy accelerators. Notice that the accelerators got bigger and bigger, and the experiment and collaboration size increased even more quickly. Atlas and CMS experiments became global, not because we wanted to work with thousands of people, but because this was the fastest way to make progress on the science that we are interested in. However, I would like to point out that our day-to-day work is still very local. We work on either detector components or physics analysis in small groups. And our graduate students and postdocs have opportunities to develop independence and creativity. Concerning a global project, one cannot get more global than Fermi's Globotron that circles the globe at the equator. Fermi was president of APS in 1953. On January 29, 1954, as the retiring president, he gave a speech entitled, "What can we learn with the high energy accelerators?" He pointed out that a powerful way to access new physics is through the development of higher and higher energy accelerators. On your right, you can see his penciled notes while he prepared this speech. The left plot shows the cost and energy of actual and planned accelerators as a function of year through 1960. Both grow exponentially. Fermi then extrapolated this to the highest energy ultimate accelerator, the Globotron. Following his extrapolation, the Globotron would have arrived in 1994, costing 170 billion 1994 US dollars, or 350 billion current dollars. As you can see from the right, Fermi's curve was remarkably correct. The Tevatron that started in the mid-80s had an energy just a little lower than the Globotron energy. So we can say that we arrived at the Globotron energy around 1990 with a size of about 10 kilometers and a few billion current dollars. Dramatically smaller and dramatically cheaper. This is due to science and technology breakthroughs and due to our culture of open science and open technology. Global projects require a long process, a decade of study, planning, and developing cutting-edge technologies, another decade of construction. So overall, it takes a couple of decades from planning, study to operation. I emphasize that less global but medium to large scale projects and facilities are also critical to particle physics. These are shared by the world community, so that taken collectively, the planning of these projects is due to global collaboration and cooperation. I'm showing in this slide an example of current and planned projects and facilities in the Americas. Balancing global to medium and small scale projects is scientifically crucial because global and larger scale projects do not address all the key scientific questions. One great example is dark matter direct search experiments. For smaller projects, the process from planning to operation can be much shorter, thus can enable near-term discoveries. Some dark matter direct search experiments are no longer small, but they all studied at a very small scale with the individual creativity and ingenuity. Smaller projects play another important role, that is the education and training of the next generation of scientists. Global project, this shows the timeline of a regional and national planning process in, I skipped one. Global, the project require long-term strategic plans. Plans in particle physics are typically developed regionally or nationally with the input from the worldwide community. Europe, for example, produces a regional plan. Countries like US, Canada, Japan, China, Korea, India produce a national plans. All these plans are developed in a global context. Each major player hopes to host a unique world-class facility at home and to partner in high priority large facility hosted elsewhere, and to perform small but high priority experiments at home. Here I show the timeline of a regional and national planning process in Europe and the Americas as an example. We update our plans every 5 to 10 years. Here is a small fraction of my CDF collaborators, very diverse as you can see. CMS and Atlas collaborations are even more diverse than this. Global collaborations have demonstrated numerous times that diverse workforce generates more innovative ideas and solutions because of their different training and background and culture. As a result, they produce a better science. This is a valuable data for our society as it seeks to improve diversity and inclusion. Finally, it's indicated in this map for locations of Sun, FremLab, and KK users, we need the effort towards true global collaborations. Latin America and Africa are in the processes of developing their strategic plans. The World Particle Physics community very much looks forward to the outcomes of these exercises. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kim. You really helped introduce a lot of the topics that we'll be discussing today about global science. I next want to welcome Professor JoAnne Hewitt, one of my own faculty colleagues from the SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory. Professor Hewitt is a theoretical physicist devoted to searches for physics beyond the standard model. She brings her perspective as a scientist and as the chair of the High Energy Physics Advisory Panel, HEPAP, and associate lab director at SLAC to the discussion. Professor Hewitt, welcome.
Thank you, Phil. And good morning to everybody. The sun has literally just risen above the horizon and is shining right in my eyes, so please forgive me if I squint a bit here at home. I would like to discuss workforce issues with respect to science on a global scale. The large international collaborations that Young-Kee just spoke to introduce several workforce concerns and advantages that need to be addressed and documented. These arise through both the necessarily large workforces and elongated timescales that are necessary to complete the construction, operations, and data analysis of an experiment. As an example, the general purpose detectors for the Large Hadron Collider, ATLAS and CMS, each consist of roughly 3,000 collaborators and took 15 to 20 years to construct. This extended timescale and collaboration has been standard for high-energy collider experiments, as Young-Kee just presented, and is beginning to become prevalent in other fields as well. The Vera C. Rubin Observatory, which will conduct the legacy survey of space and time for cosmology, will take more than 10 years of construction before operations begin in 2024, and then planned operations will continue for 10 years after that. Phase 2 of the LINAC coherent light source at SLAC has been under construction for several years, and science collaborations are growing in size. For this field, collaborations of over 100 people are just starting to occur and are large. While such issues have been present in high energy physics and nuclear physics, they're becoming increasingly standard for other fields. These long timescales and large collaborations to complete and conduct an experiment presents unique challenges to the training of the next generation of scientists, both presenting advantages and some issues that need to be watched out for. There's the opportunity to learn of different cultures and to work side by side with scientists from other regions of the world. This is an advantage that scientists in these large collaborations bring with them to their everyday life, as well as to their work experience. The different phases of an experiment, construction, operations, and data analysis, each last longer than a typical graduate student or postdoctoral appointment. In addition, specific tasks are assigned to a specific institution. The early career researcher does not always have the opportunity to become educated in different aspects necessary to mount and conduct an experiment. It can take 2 to 3 years to develop, execute, an analysis and push it through the collaboration publication procedure. Students and postdocs thus experience a more restricted and narrow education than their peers working in smaller experience. Care must be taken to ensure that students and postdocs in large collaborations have the experience in both construction, hands-on hardware work, as well as analysis or software development for a well-rounded education. One possibility is that a postdoc can take on a different or separate responsibility than they had as a student in order to broaden their experience. Sometimes folks switch experiments or physics topics altogether between their student and postdoctoral tenure in order to gain the desired breadth. How is credit assigned for work that a student or postdoc or assistant professor performs? In an alphabetized list of 300 plus authors necessary for fairness, how does an appointment or promotion evaluations committee evaluate what an individual research has done? The field has developed several solutions for this particular issue. One is to subdivide the leadership for each task at a very granular level, such that groups work in small groups and there are leaders within these small groups. A large experiment will thus have several leadership positions at all levels for both the construction and analysis phases. For example, there may be a machine learning working group led by a university postdoc or a heavy flavor tagging working group led by a postdoc at a national laboratory. And the most talented individuals in each area will be assigned these leadership positions commensurate with their experience, and then receive credit for them when it comes time for evaluation. Appointments and promotions become dependent on recommendation letters that detail the candidate's virtues. And this system depends on the familiarity of the referee with the candidate's work, as always. And the higher ranking the referee is in the collaboration management, the more weight the letter carries. Which means that these leadership positions within these small working groups carry a lot of weight in the recommendation letters and are put forward in the evaluation process at a high level. In a fair system, both of these tactics work very well. The last I would like to touch on is teaching the young generation to be creative and original and rewarding them for thinking outside of the box. Again, one must take care to expose the young generation of scientists to many different areas within their field, as the future greatly depends on recommendations of their performance. Most, if not all, areas of science are tending towards large collaborations, and the issues of the workforce and the development of the next generation of scientists needs to be thoroughly addressed for the long-term health of the fields. Thank you.
Thanks very much, JoAnne. You see, after monitoring the mute, I forget myself. I think those workforce issues are really going to be an important part of our discussion coming up. Our next panelist is Professor Luisa Cifarelli, the University of Bologna. Professor Cifarelli is an experimental particle physicist involved in the ALICE scientific collaboration at the CERN Large Hadron Collider, and also in the Dark Side collaboration at the Gran Sasso Underground Laboratory. She has been a member of several scientific or strategic committees in Europe and is currently a member of the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research Scientific Council in Dubna, Russia. Welcome, Professor Cifarelli.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation to participate in this panel. And I will try to give a little bit of international European flavor to the discussion concerning a special aspect that I wanted to touch and that I'm going to illustrate. I have been involved at CERN at the beginning of this millennium in the formulation, the elaboration of the first document on the European strategy for particle physics. And interestingly enough, this document did not concern only CERN since the beginning, but Europe as a whole and its connections with the other international partners the world over. And the current, this strategy has been updated several times, and the current update was launched last year in 2020. And it has also been presented here at the April meeting on Saturday in one of the sessions organized by the Forum on International Physics by Professor Halina Abramovic, Scientific Secretary of the European Strategy Group. And in the same session, Nigel Lockyer, Director of Fermilab, has presented the activities of the laboratory and the forward looks with reference to the P5 panel recommendations, for instance. And what was really striking is that both speakers have repeatedly used the words international, global project, global program, global endeavor. So starting from the example of the European strategy, I would like to make a few remarks about the issue, which is addressed in this strategy document, of the global distribution of large facilities, especially in the long term. Because we're all concerned by the need to avoid duplication of efforts and the need to replace regional competition, if possible, by multi-regional collaboration. This is a real challenge. And large facilities are indeed a study case. And by large facilities, for instance, I mean CERN or Fermilab with accelerators. They have a tremendous impact, environmental, social, economic, and political. I was just thinking about a number of issues. Imagine energy efficiency and saving when you run the accelerators, the big accelerators, is an issue. Mobility, when you have to take into account the travels of thousands of researchers to and from, this is an issue as well. Education and training, this was already mentioned. The flow of students and early career researchers, the flow of young minds is really important, it matters. Then you have the transfer of knowledge, of technology and innovation with the involvement of local or at large industries. Then you have the aspect of communication, dissemination, public engagement, and of course, open science, open publications, open software, open hardware. This is a very delicate issue, in my view, that is far from having a single and simple solution. It's a very complex problem. So whether we will be able to succeed in our efforts to implement really global facilities in the long term is indeed an open question. But I would like to come back to the European strategy document for a number of considerations. First of all, I found it normal, although we are talking in terms of global science, the strategy is focused on how to ensure continued scientific and technological privilege leading role for Europe, which hosts CERN, which is the largest laboratory of this kind in the world, and how to strengthen the unique system of research centers in Europe via a good cooperation between CERN and these research centers. So it is normal that the strategy addresses this point. However, apart from this, I would say, natural wish to safeguard the European primacy in this sector, the strategy clearly states that the implementation of the strategy should proceed in strong collaboration with global partners. And they mention here in particular the good support that CERN and Europe want to continue to give to the long baseline experiments in Japan and the United States. But above all, the strategy deals with the following, together with its international partners. And as a global endeavor, Europe should investigate the technical and financial feasibility of the future large collider of 100 TeV, the FCC, that Europe wishes to be built in the long term on the CERN site, together with an E+/6 and electroweak factory as a possible first stage. But in this respect, and again comes in the globalization, the strategy states that in case of a timely realization of the E+/- International Linear Collider in Japan, then the European particle physics community would be very eager to collaborate and support. And here a remark is in order. And it's the fact that our particle physics community is well aware of the competition with China concerning the building of such a large collider, which would start as an E+/- circular collider and then be upgraded in a hadron collider. I must say that Europe-China competition / collaboration has still to be figured out. There are research topics such as neutrino physics using reactors, for instance. We heard a beautiful talk yesterday at this meeting by Professor Kastenheger. Well, this aspect of research where the real international collaboration, not only with Europe, holds true, has been extremely successful and rewarding. I'm talking about the Diabei or the future Juno experiments in China. Definitely, as Kastenheger said, that this collaboration is a key for discoveries. Let me now consider another interesting aspect about the strategy for globalization in the words of the European Strategy Group. Not only one should collaborate among different countries and regions, but also with neighboring research fields. And in this case, the two fields are astroparticle physics and nuclear and heavy ion physics. Again, here, the idea is that through the coordination of bodies such as in Europe, APEC, Astroparticle Physics European Consortium, there should be a strengthening through scientific exchanges and technological cooperation of areas of common interest and the world over. As far as nuclear physics and heavy ion physics is concerned, CERN coordinates its activities through a NUPEC, which is the Nuclear Physics European Collaboration Committee, and on topics of mutual interest, and again, the world over. There are many regional nuclear physics laboratories in the world. Yankee has shown some of them in her map. Think about JLab and BNL in the United States, JPark and RIKEN in Japan, just to name a few outside Europe. CERN has its own program that will extend beyond the LHC era, but there are future European facilities such as FAIR in Germany, NICA in Russia, and ESS in Sweden that really envisage international global research programs in nuclear physics for the future. And finally, there's the electron-proton and electron-ion colliders that are of great interest for CERN, for NUPEC. And NUPEC is preparing a strong statement to support the participation of Europe in the electron-ion collider which has been approved and will be built in Brookhaven in the United States. So to sum up, there is no doubt about the wish for a global synergy in this European document that I took as a study case as far as large facilities are concerned. Let me end by saying that when I started doing research at CERN in the late 70s, there was a strong competition between different areas of the world. I remember, especially between Europe and the United States. And I don't think this is still the case. Our regional particles physics has become more and more global. Of course, geography still matters and it should matter, but the scenario of opportunities, in my view, is now global. And if you look at the experiment at CERN at Gran Sasso in Italy, there is a strong participation of physicists from all over the world, as Yankee has nicely shown. Competition exists, as it should be, but it is now more a fruitful and constructive competition between different experiments rather than a mere rivalry between regions or countries. And let me conclude with the example quoted by Nigel Lockyer. He gave us numbers in his talk. In CMS, there are about 1,000 scientists from the United States, namely 30% of the collaboration. So the competition is rather with Atlas, namely with a different experiment in the same lab and in the same facility. Indeed, this would be a very good competition. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Cifarelli. Our fourth panelist is Professor Fiona Harrison from Caltech. Professor Harrison is an experimental and observational high-energy astrophysicist. She brings to this panel her perspective as former chair of the Space Studies Board, past chair of the APS Division of Astrophysics, and chair of the Division of Physics, Mathematics, and Astronomy at Caltech. She is also co-chairing the current decadal survey in astronomy and astrophysics. Welcome, Professor Harrison.
Thank you. So can you hear me? Yeah. So I wanted to switch a bit from the particle physics perspective and talk about the perspective from astronomy and astrophysics and cosmology. And what I want to focus on is how we do planning for the big projects in particular. If you look at space missions like the upcoming James Webb Space Telescope, that's a mission that is $10 billion and is an international collaboration. Or ESA's LISA gravitational wave mission is an incredibly technologically challenging mission that has significant US participation. And if you look at these examples, you can see the great benefits of international cooperation in space, because as we imagine more and more ambitious observatories, it takes more than one country to realize them. Yet the way we plan for these and the way we decide what our next visions and next projects should be is one that is not particularly well coordinated on an international scale. And I'll show you just, let's see if I can share my screen, a couple of view graphs that explain a bit, at least focusing on the US and Europe for a minute, how we do this planning. So in the United States, at least in astronomy and astrophysics, but also in planetary science, every 10 years there's something called a decadal survey. And these decadal surveys are undertaken by the National Academy of Sciences. They're requested by the agencies who wish to have advice about what are the big scientific opportunities, and where should they invest in the coming decade or two. And in the case of astronomy and astrophysics, it's NASA, the National Science Foundation, and the Department of Energy. And the outcome of these surveys is a document that provides prioritized recommendations for US government investment in research and facilities, including projects both in space and on the ground. Now, these surveys are required actually by US law, and we're in the midst of completing one at the moment. In Europe, Europe hasn't in the past had a regular planning process like this, but this past year it did. It undertook a similar survey, Voyage 2050, which independently came out with a set of recommendations for what the European Space Agency should do in the coming decades, taking a very long-term vision, as you can see, 2050. So while there was some communication between these surveys, they are taking place independently and rather than jointly. And that's for a number of good reasons. First is we advise governments on how they should spend their resources. And as other speakers have alluded to, there's always a sense of wanting US leadership. Where can we have a unique role? And there's a sense of competition too, honestly. And that comes very much into play when we're considering the big projects. Where can the US lead? And in Europe, where can Europe lead? And there's, of course, consideration of what's happening in an international landscape, but I would say it's less than coordinated. And I can provide some examples of how this has been problematic. One example I'll use is in the 2010 survey, the top recommendation for space was a mission called W-FIRST, which is now the Roman telescope, which has as one of its major goals to do very large-scale surveys of the universe to look at the growth of structure and therefore place constraints on dark energy. While this recommendation was being written, the Europeans were separately, considering the Euclid mission, which had quite similar goals. In the end, the world is building both, and one could ask, is that the best outcome? Would it have been different had there been some communication and more global planning? Now, don't get me wrong, both are tremendously exciting missions, but we might have been able to accelerate something else. For example, I think we're all very excited about the Luisa gravitational wave mission, and it might have been possible, for example, to have more joint cooperation from the beginning on that mission. So I think often it works, and certainly the agencies work hard to contribute to these ambitious and large missions, no matter who is leading them. But the planning process is one that is not coordinated. And I think it's an interesting topic for our discussion. What are the benefits and the barriers to improving that going forward? So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Professor Harrison. So now we're going to go into the part of this panel where we get to have some free discussion. And before we get started, I want to remind everyone who's viewing this that you can put your questions in the Q&A window, and I will get to as many of those questions as I can. I want to start, though, by picking up a couple of threads from Professor Harrison's starting remarks, and then some of the others about planning, the need for coordinated advanced planning. Of course, that this question about why planning is so hard internationally always runs into the word competition. And international collaborators can, of course, also be competitors, and they can be competitors in other areas, particularly the economy and even sometimes politics or the military. And that really influences collaboration. So I wonder if Professor Cifarelli could pick up on that thread and make a few comments about this tension between competition and collaboration.
Yes, it's a very delicate issue, and it is also difficult to define what is good competition, bad competition, or what is good collaboration or bad collaboration. But without going again through some of the things that could be further deepened concerning what I said between Europe, US, Asia, and so on, I wanted to introduce one concept that maybe has not been mentioned enough so far, apart from in the last slides of Professor Kim, namely the fact that there are examples where we're trying really to join forces in I would say, super partes in Latin way. And I have in mind the examples of the big collaborations we mentioned in Atlas. There are over 5,000 physicists, and they are from more than 100 different countries. And you see Palestinians together with Israeli researchers, Syria, Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, and they're all working together without borders and without barriers. And this is really a fantastic way to collaborate above competition. Then we have examples like the projects we all know, which is Sesame in Jordan. This is really an example where the joint venture is incredible in the Middle East among member states such as Cyprus, Egypt, Iran, Israel, Jordan, Pakistan, Palestine, and Turkey. It's just incredible. And I like to remind here that the initiator of all this was Herwig Schopper from CERN, and Sesame is a synchrotron light source. But the structure of the project is really open-minded, as CERN has been funded after the war. And there are, as current observers, Brazil, Canada, China, CERN, the European Union, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Japan, Kuwait, Portugal, Russian Federation, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and the United States of America, of course. Another very significant example will be the African Light Source Project, which will be something similar to being implemented in the African continent. And finally, another very nice example I want to quote is the Southeast European International Institute for Sustainable Technologies, called CEIST, in Montenegro, to create a center for hadron therapy in the Balkan region, a region, again, which only 10 or 20 years ago was undergoing a tremendous war. And the partners are people who were fighting each other, like Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. So this is very important in my view, this way of joining forces above other questions. And it brings also me to a key issue that is the involvement of emerging countries, scientifically emerging countries in the scenario of our big projects and big collaborations. Physics for development is the leitmotif of the APS Forum of International Physics and of the Committee on International Scientific Affairs of the American Physical Society. Exchange programs on a global scale are very important. Researchers should be exchanged on both directions. And when researchers go back to their home country, they should be able to continue their work and disseminate the acquired knowledge. And embedded in all this, I think the gender issue is of paramount importance in emerging countries.
Well, this actually, speaks to what I say is currently the most popular question in the question and answer window. People can vote. I don't know if you've noticed this. You probably have, that you can vote for the question you like the most. Let me read it. That doesn't have a named author. Clearly, poor countries are left behind. They have bright and talented scientists, but lack the funding to bring to the table. What can be done to be more inclusive, help these scientists in Africa, Latin America, and some Asian countries, and not to look like a club of those who have funding? So I think, Luisa, you spoke to this. Perhaps we could hear from Young-Kee, who's been involved a lot in the planning. Are these considerations important in planning for the future of high energy physics, and what is done to explicitly involve the poorer countries?
Thank you, Phil, for addressing that question to me. I don't know, I should have thanked you, but it is a very difficult question, and it's not easy to answer. Of course, for our planning exercise, first of all, I want to point out that you start with studying the big science questions and what kind of opportunities to address those questions. And this kind of questions, even though this is let's say, example of SNOMES, this is a US plan, but the community who involved in all the sciences and opportunity discussions, these are we do together. Everybody we welcome everybody to join. So in this kind of scientific side or discussing about opportunities, all that, I think this is just really open to everybody. So whether you have a lot of the money for your own countries or not, I think this is really open to that. So this is a great opportunities for those countries. And of course, the next step is more prioritizing projects and etc. That's beyond our scientific community. This is a more funding agencies driven community looking at those projects and what can be done in your home institutes and what countries and what you can partner in with other facilities elsewhere, and that kind of discussions. But certainly the scientific discussions, we really hope that as many the community members, doesn't matter where you're from, they can be participate. So that's something that we really strongly emphasize that. So I was thinking, listening to your question, I'm from Korea, that my country, certainly 1970s, that we didn't have any facilities at all. Literally no the groups and etc. But at that point, the Fermi Lab really helped Korean scientists. They are from Korean institutions, So there are quite a bit of some financial support and engaging them to fix target experiments at Fiona Lab. I remember when I studied, just before I started on my PhD program, KK actually was very open to the institutions in China and institutions in Korea. So they bring them to actually the experiments in KK. So there are quite a bit of very proactive the efforts from both the Fiona Lab starting from 1970s and in KK Japan from 1980s. And that really helped to get through to where they are. Now Korea is very strong in many ways, and China as well. But another one that I remember is that even the end of 1970s, during Deng Xiaoping time and Carter time, there's a US-China high energy physics cooperation. So, even during that time, US was quite supportive of the science in China, and there were quite a bit of support and still going on that annual meetings. So there are a couple of examples that I'm just giving you. One, from my own country and compared to what it was and what's now, dramatic changes. So there are a lot of things that can be done in that way.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Kim. I'm just reminded, I'm really struck by something that Professor Cifarelli brought up, which was about SESAME. Now, SESAME is not a high energy physics experiment. It's an accelerator. It's a light source. And what occurs to me is that different fields of physics treat this issue of global access to facilities in different ways. High energy physics, as we've heard, has a need for an intricate planning process, not only to involve the building of the machine, but also the building of the experiments and using it. Whereas in synchrotrons worldwide, although it may be a multinational effort or may not be to build the synchrotron, it is nonetheless freely open to be used by anyone at no charge, more or less forever. Following that, which actually makes it possible for people from less well-resourced areas to take the same advantage of the light source as the people from the country that built it. And I think that astronomy and astrophysics with the large telescopes has yet a third kind of way to involve the entire world. I wonder if Professor Harrison can comment on that.
Yeah, so we have a policy in the US called Open Skies, which means data is available, it's archived. The software that is required to analyze it is all made available and usable. And so anyone in the world can analyze and use data from any of our instruments. It doesn't extend to things like experiments that are smaller, just because there's a investment required in order to do that. But certainly for all the large NASA and NSF projects, that's the policy. Now, it can be somewhat controversial because not all countries have that same policy, but I think it works very strongly to the benefit of science and the advancement of science and the inclusivity of science.
On this topic of broad participation, one of the questions in the chat window, I think, is particularly relevant here, and particularly for this group of panelists. In recent years, this is from Tao Han. In recent years, we are facing challenges from certain government policies, such as limiting collaborations with scientists from certain countries, restrictions on visas for students, and access to research labs. How should we proceed to effectively maintain open collaborations for basic research. So maybe this is a good discussion to be kicked off by Professor Hewitt from the SLAC National Laboratory.
Yes, this is a very current issue and a very thorny issue. Within science, we believe that open science does the best science. That's how you get science done. I think most of us believe that. But there are also some national security issues which come into play, mainly economic issues with the development of new technologies. And the openness by which all science can be conducted can be monitored by governments, and it is seemingly becoming increasingly monitored by governments across the world. The restrictions that one face is, there has to be a delicate, this is a very tricky question to answer. There needs to be a delicate balance between having an open science so that you can have the rapid progress and development of scientific ideas and thoughts and results and discoveries. It does need to be balanced with some national security issues in terms of economic competitiveness or advantages, or shall I say, equality. And there should be a dialogue between the scientific community and governments to find the right balance here is my belief. And I think I'll just stop there.
I do agree with you that this is a thorny issue in all areas of international science right now. I'm wondering, just to kind of tie this back to our previous issue, how does this at the national laboratories, when you do when you do forward planning, of course, all of these projects are international. So how do you handle these competition issues in that case?
In many different ways, and it really depends upon the specific example or scientific project that you have. And a national laboratory for a facility that you have on site that is funded by the US government, you do need to follow rules and regulations that are set forth by the US government. They fund the facility. For collaboration in experiments or facilities that are overseas, it can be much more open in the sense that American scientists can go overseas and work side by side with scientists from other nations. For facilities that we operate abroad, which happens mainly in my field, in astroparticle physics, there are cases where the data itself can have some security issues and where limitation of participation, again, is mandated by the US government. But at a national laboratory, DOE-funded national laboratory, we do need to follow the DOE regulations along these lines. It is more constrained than in universities.
I think, of course, this discussion, and it's actually lighting up the chat window as well, or the Q&A window as well, could fill the rest of our time, but I don't want it to, because I really do want to spend some time focusing more on the issue of the scientists themselves. And there are a number of questions about that have to do with credit and publications. Maybe to start it off, I can just start with a question that was submitted by Robert Garisto, who of course is one of our physical review editors. Should large collaborations be encouraged to annotate their author lists to indicate the main roles displayed by some or all of the authors on a given paper, such as one of the groups JoAnne Hewitt mentions? For example, on CDF and D0 joint papers, the Tevatron Electroweak Working Group was singled out. And I suppose we've had some discussion from from several of you on this, but perhaps Professor Cifarelli, since you also talked a little bit about this issue in your opening remarks, you could say something about this issue of assigning credit in author lists.
Yes, this is extremely delicate, especially when young people have to compete for positions, to understand what is their role, what is their contribution to the papers. And in our discipline, with those numbers, it is really, it has become something extremely difficult. However, I think that one should pay attention to the so-called corresponding authors for each publication. And the other thing that really matters is look at the presentations that I'm just talking about the young people, not about us, let's say, because I mean, people know the role we had in various experiments and ventures. So, I mean, they know more or less what we should be credited for. But for the young people, I think it's important then to look at all the presentations, posters, conference contributions they are given. And I think that from that, one can really understand what is their contribution to the publication. If this was the question, as I understood, it's my point of view.
I think this is also an area where there are really different. I was once asked by a dean in a previous university that I worked at, University of Michigan, to write a really succinct list of criteria that would tell the dean how to assign credit based on an author list in a physics paper. And it was really hard to keep that description to less than a page because it's so complicated. Professor Kim, you had your hand raised. You want to contribute to this?
Yes, yeah, I have my experiences as the Atlas collaborator. In terms of the official publication list, we are doing alphabetic order from all the people who have contributed, because of course, the specific analysis is done by a small group, but a lot of detector work to software construction work to many important algorithms, etc. It's all contributed by many people. So it's that's how author list is made. But I want to point out that as an example in Atlas, for each analysis, which paper, there's internal information that we go there and make a list of people who contributed for that specific analysis and the roles from junior, the senior, everybody, from students, postdoc, and advisors, etc. So we have to write down their roles for this specific paper. So we have that information. So this is shared by entire 3,000 Atlas collaborators. So that itself is already a big part of our community, and they know what kind of contributions each individual has made. So that information is available and then can be used for any promotions or any the other finding jobs and etc.
So this is a real example of a cultural shift, because of course traditionally one considers that too close an association with someone who's coming up for tenure, if you're being asked to write a letter, this constitutes a conflict of interest. And yet, if you've never heard of the person, of course, you can't comment. And so we do need to have structures, and I think it's good that the collaborations themselves appreciate this. Professor Harrison, in astronomy with large projects like telescopes, how is this issue of credit handled?
Yeah, well, so I think astronomy is catching up to particle physics in terms of the size of our collaborations. I'll note that the paper on the electromagnetic follow-up of the LIGO's binary neutron star included something like a third of the community. And we haven't figured it out either, to be honest. It is an increasing it used to be people went to the telescope, took their data, wrote it up. There'd be 2 or 3 authors on the publications. Now, you know, it's really becoming a challenge. And I think it's a bit similar to what Luisa said. One looks at providing opportunities to give talks, to present posters, to talk about individual work, but it's definitely challenging.
I mean, in the end, it's really like with so many other human activities, it's all about relationships. That is, what constitutes qualification for career advancement is a little bit difficult to certainly put in terms of metrics. You want to know enough about the person to have confidence that in the future they'll be a good colleague. And this really runs us right into this cultural issue of what are the best practices. The whole idea of collaboration and competition has been is something that's really been something almost all the speakers have talked about, and there's a question in the Q&A window on that. Your thoughts on the idea that global science, and indeed all science, seeks to understand the universe and therefore by its definition a collaborative collective enterprise across all borders, and therefore the competitive framework is antithetical to this and really should be left behind. And does anyone have any thoughts on I think everyone would say yes, I agree with that, but the difficulty is convincing somebody that yes, JoAnne.
Yeah, I'd like to just bring up basically the opening sentence in the 2014 P5 report. That's the Particle Physics Project Prioritization Panel. Those are the 5 Ps. And that is essentially that science is a global field. And you need to plan on this in the global context. If each main region of the world has their own large science projects and their own small science projects, then people around the world can come and contribute and do their investigations at those facilities. So they're really, if we can get to the point in the future where we don't have borders with science and facilities, but it's regional, and each region has their large and their small projects, and then the scientists from around the world can go to those regions and do their science at those facilities, or do them via Zoom from their own home, wherever they may be, then perhaps we can really get to the point where we don't have these borders and these competitive actions.
Are there things like Zoom that are going to convince our true patrons, who are the taxpayers, the global taxpayers, that it's a good idea to have these border to downplay the role of your country in partial ownership of some large project, and to it almost seems like it's running against a number of political themes right now. So how do you strike this balance? And that's not a question directed at anyone in particular. I don't know that anyone has this solved. Although Professor Cifarelli, coming from Europe, has had a several decades long, more or less successful experiment in breaking down the importance of borders, particularly for science. Do you think that is something that is, in any sense, a model that now just naturally expands to include the world, including traditional enemies?
I don't know what the definition of traditional enemies is, but
That's in Germany.
because this is past, you know, there are newcomers.
Yeah.
But let's say that one should be on the good side, and utopia is something that matters. I think that science without borders is, as was just said by JoAnne, where you create facilities where everybody can come, and this should be the right thing to do, where of course the geography matters, because there will be places where, even for historical reasons, think about CERN. I cannot imagine that all in a sudden we close CERN to go and build another lab somewhere else to make the next accelerator. It would not be really wise. But the fact that then it is in Europe would not prevent anybody from all parts of the world, even the most difficult places from Africa, from Latin America, to come and participate. So I think that the fact that one should really reach a level where, for true, we will have science without borders and without secrets is something we must pursue. Of course, it is difficult because there are many other interests, as you mentioned, and life is not easy for reasons that have nothing to do with science in the end. But the good use of science is something which is different from what may happen in reality. So there is science, and then there is the application of science. And the application of science then has a series of complications that when we just do fundamental blue sky research, we don't think about it, but in reality it exists. So I'm not sure there is a complete solution to our problem here.
Well, I think in astrophysics, they seem to have naturally overcome this for a number of specific reasons. I mean, you have to go to a tall mountain. If you happen to be in the Netherlands, it's not going to be there. You have to go to outer space. You're not going to keep your satellite from flying over every possible country, and so it's just accepted. But it's a little different when all of the effort to construct ITER will benefit more the region where ITER is built, even if ITER is globally used and even globally financed. You have to convince. We've had this difficulty convincing taxpayers that it was a good idea to put lots of money into a facility in Europe for a long time, and yet we kind of struggle, and it does happen. Professor Kim, you have your hand raised also.
Yeah, I would like to add our experiences, very recent experiences, also following Phil, the discussion about the Zoom world, the virtual world, whether this can add another benefit to everybody. So the SNOMES, this is studying our future scientific visions in particle physics and etc. We had a lot of efforts last year. So we had a planning meeting in October. Original plan was having, of course, in-person meeting and thinking that about 400 or 500 people will show up. But of course, because of pandemic, we made it virtual. So even though the time constraint, because this is a very US-centric timeline, we got 3,000 people joining from all over the world. So 400-500 in-person meeting, that's our original thought. Even though this was supposed to be very international community coming, but of course, various regions, if people have to travel and you need a financial support to go there, we couldn't think of more than 400 or 500 the participants. That became 3,000 from all over the world. So of course, in-person meeting, there are a lot of values, but also this inclusion and diversity, and again, without borders, anybody can come and talking about science and our future directions. I think having this virtual meeting has some very important assets. So I don't have a clear solutions, but I think we all together to think about how we combine in-person to virtual so that the discussions and collaboration and cooperations, everything, especially thinking about also future decisions or other collaborative work, if we can utilize all the functions of this virtual the mechanisms, and they may be able to help the very, very true global participations, collaboration directions.
You can certainly think about these very large Zoom audiences as maybe also overcoming some of these concerns that are mostly voiced by governments, of course, about potential national security or economic espionage problems with allowing just anyone to come onto a national laboratory site, for example. I think that it's quite clear that the agencies are still considering wrestling with how they handle the Zoom world. But it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, if we could find a way to maintain the appropriate level of security that's really required, and yet allow appropriate access that's not just over the telephone. I think would be very, very, very helpful. And there's also I want to divert our discussion a little bit. Instead of talking about nations competing with nations, just within countries, how globalization is affecting the broader landscape of how science is done, which is, of course, mostly not in the big labs, but in universities. So there's a question from Zach Sullivan. As the costs of globalized science has risen, smaller U.S. institutions are increasingly being left out of the picture. Theory in particular has been largely abandoned by the U.S. These are not my words. This is Zach Sullivan saying this. I'm not sure that I would agree with that. COVID has accelerated this process. How do we reverse these trends? Well, you may not believe, you may not agree with the specific comment about theory being abandoned, but clearly there is a trend, a sort of a rich get richer trend. And so how do we overcome that? Let's see. Perhaps we should start with Professor Harrison.
Well, yeah, that's I also wouldn't necessarily agree that we're abandoning theory, although I will say, and at least in my field, I believe it's underfunded. I don't have a great answer. It takes resources to do science. That's a fact. And it's necessarily going to be countries that have resources to bring to bear on scientific problems that are going to lead. How do we try to make it more universal? I think our university system is open, and I think we need to fight hard to continue to make that the case. Again, I'll go back to the open data example. The more we can support an international community to use the data that comes from experiments that perhaps are largely funded by a small number of countries, I think that that's a direction we should go. But I'm not sure I answered the question, but those are my thoughts.
Oh, I think it's a difficult question. The question is of course embedded in the issue of how science education is funded in the U.S., not just the research. We have a tradition of funding the education and training of students and postdocs from projects. And so as the projects get to be parceled into very large mega projects and not lots of, so-called small science, which is in my field not a pejorative term at all. It's a kind of a badge of honor. You don't want the small science to be left out. It's actually where a lot of the talent is getting trained. And I believe this is done somewhat differently in Europe, where the cost of training, the cost of the salary to train a student is not borne by the project, but rather in some other way. But in the U.S., it really is done that way. Do you get the sense, for example, Young-Kee in this NOMAS, these 3,000 individuals? I mean, I assume 3,000 is such a large number compared to the size of the division of particles and fields, for example, that it must have included very, very broad participation. So, do you get the sense that the future is actually more inclusive rather than more restrictive, as this question suggested?
Both. Certainly, I think it's more inclusive. Again, there are many ways of communications, and modern technologies certainly help. It's really broadened and more inclusive. That's happening. But of course, there are issues of certain countries that we discussed earlier that that becomes, it's much more, again, less global, but on another axis, it becomes really more global. So there's a interesting tension between the two. In terms of, you mentioned about, just commenting earlier, comments about Europe, Asia is also similar in terms of education or people. They are not included in the project. So in some sense, that's somewhat protected. And US is a little bit unique that capturing all the people's work, people's time is as a part of project cost. So that made especially theorists a bit harsh. We have general issues about support of research for either experimentalists and theorists, but some experimentalists can be part of a project. It's hard for theorists to be part of a project. So it is a bit US unique situation for that.
We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to return to an area that has been, there's been a number of questions on, and we haven't really discussed it. And that is open access, not just with respect to data, but with respect to the whole issue of journal publishing and how this restricts how collaborations publish, and is kind of forcing the issue with publishers. How is this affecting your field? And let me first turn to Professor Hewitt to comment on this.
Yes. I believe, as Young-Kee was just making a distinction between experimenters and theorists, I think there is a small difference between the two different subfields here in terms of publication. For theory, what really matters the most is who gets their paper out first on the archive. A lot of the credit is given simply by the publication of the preprint on the archive. And then publication in the referee journal afterwards is important for appointment and promotion evaluation, but not as much for advancing the field forward, because the field just moves so fast. Experiments, on the other hand, because of competition with other collaborations, tend to be more conservative about putting their preprints on the archive, versus publication in journals. And many times they submit their publications to the archive and the journal at the same time instead of in advance like theorists do. And I believe in that particular case, the open access issue is an extremely important one for underrepresented countries and institutions, for that matter, who may not be able to afford the subscriptions to the journals so that their researchers can log into the journals. I think moving forward, the field seems to be moving more and more towards open access. As Fiona said earlier, with the Open Skies Agreement in astronomy, that the data is available. With the advent of the archive and its now prevalence, not only in physics, but basically all areas of science, there's this preprint or pre-publication notion is gaining traction as well. So I think open access might be a wave of the future for publications as well.
Luisa, did you want to comment?
Yes, the CERN model was in our field the first one that I know which really turned out to be exemplary for other fields. But of course, someone has to pay for it. And there is a consortium which has been created where all member states contribute, they pay a priori. And then the author paying procedure for open access is bypassed because we publish without paying, provided it's on one of those journals that have agreed to the consortium. So it's a kind of pool of publications which are differently funded, and then everything is open access. And it's very interesting for the following reason, that it doesn't discriminate between those who have those little groups having money for an auto pay procedure. In that case, it is granted by their research institution or even by states in the end. So I like very much this model, but it is not already implemented in all sectors, in all countries. And it should not, in any case, jeopardize the publishing houses, because this would be unfair. So a good compromise is those agreements that the big publishing houses are making with, for instance, in Germany, with all the Max Planck and Fraunhofer institutes. They make some special agreements in the same way that they have done with CERN. So this is the model that has been spreading around in Europe. I don't know about the United States, but it seems to work quite nicely.
I can certainly, I seem to be the representative of small science here, so I can certainly comment that one of the big concerns is that placing the publication cost on the researcher in an era of constrained budgets is certainly a concern. And so this is something that then becomes a funding agency concern. I'm also a bit taken that, it seems like there are always winners and losers, and we don't want the losers to be people from disadvantaged areas of the world that don't have the resources to pay subscription fees. We don't want them to be the losers. So instead, sometimes it seems like we have to choose that the loser is the level of independence that you have to publish something. That is, you're in order to have this be in this, the consortia agreements are made between the publishing houses and the large laboratory, or even on a national scale, and so it certainly then does restrict your options if you want to be covered under that agreement. Professor Hewitt brought up the archive. It hasn't really been mentioned much, so let me just close by asking, oh, wait a second, we're out of time. I can't do that. I'm sorry, we are out of time. We're constrained to end on time. I want to thank all of the speakers, Young-Kee Kim, Luisa, Cifarelli, Fiona Harrison, and JoAnne Hewitt for joining us on this wonderful and informative discussion on global science.